March 11, 1968, 3:45 in the morning. On top of a 5,800-foot mountain in northern Laos, 19 American airmen were about to die. They didn't know it yet. They were manning radar equipment, guiding bombers through the darkness toward targets in North Vietnam, doing their jobs, thinking they were safe, thinking the mountain itself would protect them. They were wrong. At that moment, 33 North Vietnamese commandos were climbing the sheer cliffs on the north side of Pho Phia Thi Mountain, climbing in total darkness, no lights, no sound. Each man carrying 90 pounds of weapons, ammunition, explosives, and rations. Climbing rock faces that American commanders had declared impossible to scale. Climbing toward the secret radar installation, codenamed Lima Site 85. Climbing toward the largest single ground combat loss the United States Air Force would suffer in the entire Vietnam War. Make sure you subscribe to our channel to discover more untold stories from history. This is the story of Lima Site 85, a secret base that shouldn't have existed in a country where America wasn't supposed to be fighting. A radar facility so effective, it directed 27% of all bombing missions against North Vietnam. A mountaintop fortress that commanders thought was impregnable. And the night it fell in less than 30 minutes to an enemy that wasn't supposed to be able to reach it. For 30 years, this story was classified top secret. The families of the men who died were told lies. The American public never knew it happened. Even today, 60 years later, most Americans have never heard of Lima Site 85. But it was the deadliest ground battle the Air Force fought in Vietnam. And it happened because of decisions made in Geneva 6 years earlier. 1962. Geneva, Switzerland. Representatives from 14 nations gathered to negotiate peace in Laos. The small landlocked nation in Southeast Asia had been torn apart by civil war. Royalist forces backed by the United States fought communist Pathet Lao forces backed by North Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, North Vietnam's supply route to the south, ran right through Laotian territory. Thousands of North Vietnamese troops operated in Laos. Thousands more were transiting through, on their way to fight in South Vietnam. The Geneva Conference on Laos produced the International Agreement on the Neutrality of Laos. 14 nations signed it, including the United States and North Vietnam. The agreement was simple. Laos would be neutral. All foreign military forces would withdraw. No nation would use Laotian territory for military purposes. Everyone would respect Laotian sovereignty. It was a beautiful agreement. And from the day it was signed, every major party violated it. North Vietnam never withdrew its forces from Laos. Why would they? The Ho Chi Minh Trail was their lifeline to the war in South Vietnam. Without it, they couldn't sustain their forces in the south. So they kept thousands of troops in Laos, kept building roads through the mountains, kept moving supplies and reinforcements south. They just did it secretly, and they claimed they weren't there at all. The United States faced a dilemma. North Vietnam was using Laos to win the war in South Vietnam. American commanders wanted to stop them, but the Geneva Accords prohibited American military forces in Laos. If America sent troops there openly, it would violate an international agreement it had just signed. That would be politically disastrous. It would give the Soviets and Chinese propaganda ammunition. It might escalate the war in unpredictable ways. So, America decided to fight a secret war. A war that officially didn't exist. A war that would be waged by the CIA and not the military. A war that used irregular forces, mercenaries, and advisors instead of American combat troops. A war that, if anyone asked, America would deny was happening. The CIA recruited the Hmong people of northern Laos. The Hmong had been fighting the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese for years. They were fierce fighters. They knew the terrain. They hated the communists. The CIA armed them, trained them, paid them, and used them as a proxy army to fight North Vietnam in Laos while pretending America wasn't involved. Air America, the CIA's airline, flew supply missions throughout Laos. C-123 and C-130 transports delivered weapons, ammunition, food, and medicine to remote mountain bases. Helicopters ferried Hmong fighters in and out of battle, and everyone maintained the fiction that these were civilian operations, not military ones. The planes wore civilian markings. The pilots were officially civilians. Never mind that they were retired military pilots doing military missions. Officially, they were civilians. American military forces did operate in Laos, but secretly. Fighter bombers struck targets along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in operations called Steel Tiger and Tiger Hound. B-52 bombers carpet-bombed suspected enemy supply routes in strikes called Arc Light. Special forces teams conducted reconnaissance missions, calling themselves Studies and Observations Group to hide their military nature. Thousands of Americans fought in Laos. Officially, none of them were there. This was the secret war, a war fought in the shadows, a war the American public knew nothing about, a war where the normal rules didn't apply because officially the war didn't exist. And in this secret war, the Air Force wanted to build a radar facility on top of a mountain in northern Laos, a facility that would give American bombers unprecedented accuracy striking targets in North Vietnam, a facility that would be called Lima Site 85, 1966. American bombers were pounding North Vietnam in Operation Rolling Thunder. F-105, Thunder Chiefs and F-4 Phantoms struck targets around Hanoi and Haiphong daily. B-52s flew Arc Light missions from Guam. The bombing was supposed to force North Vietnam to negotiate, to stop supporting the war in the South, to accept that they couldn't win. But the bombing had a problem: weather. The northeast monsoon season, from October to April, brought constant cloud cover to North Vietnam. Pilots couldn't see their targets. Visual bombing became impossible. During the monsoon, there were maybe 4 or 5 days a month with clear enough skies for visual strikes around Hanoi. The rest of the time, the bombers sat on the ground or flew missions to South Vietnam, where the weather was better. And North Vietnam got a reprieve from the bombing. The Air Force had radar systems that could guide bombs through clouds. Combat Sky Spot used ground-based radar to track aircraft and calculate release points for their bombs. The system worked, but it had limitations. Range. The radar sites were in South Vietnam or Thailand, hundreds of miles from the targets in North Vietnam. At that distance, accuracy suffered. The farther the aircraft from the radar, the less precise the bombing. What the Air Force needed was a radar site close to North Vietnam, close enough to track aircraft accurately all the way to Hanoi, close enough to guide bombs with precision even through solid cloud cover. A radar site that would let American bombers strike North Vietnam year-round, regardless of weather. That would eliminate the monsoon season sanctuary that gave North Vietnam time to rebuild after each wave of attacks. Someone looked at a map and found Phu Pha Thi, a mountain in northern Laos, just 15 miles from the North Vietnamese border, 50 miles from Hanoi. At 5,800 feet, it was one of the highest peaks in the region, perfect for a radar site. From that elevation, radar would have line of sight to targets deep in North Vietnam. The range would be nearly 200 miles. Every major target in northern North Vietnam would be in range. There was just one problem. Actually, several problems. Pho Pha Thi was in Laos, and the Geneva Accords prohibited American military installations there. The mountain was in territory controlled by the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese. It was surrounded by enemy forces. Supplies would have to be flown in by helicopter. There was no road access. And if the enemy attacked, there was no easy way to evacuate or reinforce the position. But the Air Force really wanted that radar site. They convinced the CIA and the ambassador to Laos, William Sullivan, that it was worth the risk. The radar's value to the bombing campaign outweighed the dangers. So in August 1966, the plan was approved. Build a tactical air navigation system, TACAN, on top of Pho Pha Thi. Call it Lima Site 85, using the CIA's designation system for landing sites in Laos. Man it with Air Force technicians who would be officially discharged from the military and become civilian contractors for Lockheed. This process was called sheep dipping. On paper, these men weren't military, they were civilians. The fiction would be maintained. The Hmong secured Pho Pha Thi in late 1966. They flattened the summit with hand tools and explosives, creating a helicopter landing zone. Then, Air America helicopters flew in the TACAN equipment, a tactical air navigation beacon that would help American aircraft find their way to targets in North Vietnam. The system went operational in early 1967. It worked well enough that planners wanted more. In mid-1967, they decided to upgrade Limacite 85 with a TSQ-81 radar system. This was a portable version of the MSQ-77 Combat Sky Spot radar. It could track multiple aircraft simultaneously and calculate precise bomb release points. With this system, Limacite 85 wouldn't just be a navigation beacon, it would be a bombing control site. Radar operators on the mountain could guide aircraft to their targets, tell them exactly when to release their bombs, and do it all through solid clouds, night or day, any weather. This would revolutionize the air war against North Vietnam. The mission was given the codename Project Heavy Green. Commando Club was the designation for bombing operations directed by Limacite 85. Everything about it was classified. The Air Force handpicked the technicians, radar experts, the best in their field, men who could maintain and operate the complex equipment under primitive conditions, men who could be trusted with secrets, men who wouldn't talk about what they were doing. The sheep-dipping process began. These airmen signed papers showing they'd been discharged from the Air Force. Officially, they became civilian employees of Lockheed Corporation. They kept their rank and pay. When their tour in Laos ended, they'd be reinstated in the Air Force with no loss of seniority or benefits. But while they were in Laos, they weren't military. They were civilians, working for a defense contractor, on a project that didn't officially exist, in a country where America wasn't officially fighting. The men were told they couldn't wear uniforms, couldn't carry military ID, couldn't even carry weapons initially because civilian contractors weren't allowed to be armed. They were supposed to rely on the Hmong and Thai defenders for security. Never mind that they were on top of a mountain in enemy territory. Never mind that North Vietnamese forces operated all around them. Officially, they were just civilians operating a navigation beacon. Nothing military about it at all. The TSQ-81 radar system arrived in pieces throughout October 1967. Air America CH-53 helicopters flew the equipment to the Mountaintop. The radar van, the antenna, the power generators, the operations building. All of it lifted by helicopter and assembled on the summit. It was an engineering feat, getting all that equipment to the top of a 5,800-foot mountain with no road access. But the Air Force made it happen. On November 1st, 1967, Limacite 85 became operational. The first Commando Club mission went out that day. An F-105 Thunder Chief, guided by the radar on Pho Pha Thi, struck a target in North Vietnam through solid cloud cover. The pilot never saw the target, didn't need to. The radar operators on the mountain tracked him, calculated his bomb release point, and gave him the command over the radio. Ready, ready, now. The pilot released his bombs. They hit the target. The mission was a success. Over the next 4 months, Limacite 85 would direct 507 bombing missions against North Vietnam and northern Laos. During the monsoon season, when weather made visual bombing impossible, Limacite 85 guided 23% of all strikes in northern North Vietnam. Without it, those missions couldn't have been flown. The bombing campaign would have stopped during the monsoon. North Vietnam would have had months to recover. Limacite 85 changed the air war, made it relentless, gave the bombing campaign the capability to strike year-round regardless of weather. And that made Limacite 85 a target. Because North Vietnam noticed what was happening, and they started looking for the radar facility that was making precision bombing through clouds possible. The airmen who manned Limacite 85 were volunteers. Nobody was ordered to go there. The mission was too dangerous, too sensitive, too classified. The Air Force couldn't compel men to become civilians and fight in a country where America wasn't supposed to be. So they asked for volunteers. And they got them. Because these were the kind of men who volunteered for dangerous missions. Chief Master Sergeant Richard Etchberger was one of them, born March 5th, 1933, in Hamburg, Pennsylvania. Grew up during the Depression and World War II. His family struggled financially. His father lost his job during the Depression, then worked managing a five-and-dime store after the war. Richard and his older brother Robert worked in the store, learning the value of hard work, learning that nothing came easy, that you earned everything through effort and dedication. Richard Etchberger graduated from Hamburg High School in 1951. He was class president, played basketball, worked on the school newspaper. He wasn't rich, wasn't from a privileged background, just a small-town Pennsylvania kid who wanted to make something of himself. In August 1951, 3 months after graduation, he enlisted in the Air Force. He was 18 years old. He took to military life immediately, completed basic training, then electronics school, then radar bomb scoring school. He was good at it. Technical systems made sense to him. He had the patience to troubleshoot complex equipment, the discipline to follow procedures exactly, the intelligence to understand how the systems worked. His superiors noticed. This was a man who would go far in the Air Force. Etchberger married, started a family. He and his wife Catherine had 3 sons, Richard, Stephen, and Corey. He was a devoted father when he was home, but he was often away. Assignments took him all over. That's how military life works. You go where you're ordered, you serve where you're needed. Your family understands or they don't, but the mission comes first. By 1967, Etchberger was a Chief Master Sergeant, the highest enlisted rank, the top 0.8% of the Air Force. He'd been in for 16 years. He was an expert in radar systems, exactly the kind of man the Air Force needed for Project Heavy Green. When Colonel Jerry Clayton, the commander of the Massacre 85 mission, met Etchberger, he knew immediately this was someone he wanted. Clayton later said that Etchberger's attitude, professionalism, and work ethic impressed him. The way he dressed, the way he carried himself, the way he approached his job with complete seriousness. This was an airman who could be trusted with a classified mission in a hostile environment. Etchberger volunteered for Massacre 85. Why? His sons would never know for certain. He couldn't tell them what he was doing. The mission was classified. All they knew was that their father was going overseas, working for Lockheed, some kind of civilian job. When they asked questions, he couldn't answer. Security. Need to know. The usual military explanations that don't really explain anything. Maybe Etchberger volunteered because he believed in the mission, believed that stopping communist aggression in Southeast Asia mattered, that the bombing campaign was necessary, that his skills could make a difference. Maybe he volunteered because it was a challenge, a chance to do something important, something that few others could do. Maybe he volunteered because he was a professional military man, and professionals go where they're needed most, regardless of danger. Or maybe he volunteered because that's what Chief Master Sergeants do. They lead from the front, they take the hard jobs. They set the example for junior enlisted personnel. They show through their actions what it means to serve. Whatever his reasons, Etchberger signed the papers, officially left the Air Force, became a civilian contractor for Lockheed, and deployed to Massacre 85 as the ground radar superintendent, the senior enlisted man on the mountain, responsible for maintaining the radar system and leading the crew of technicians who operated it. The other airmen on Massacre 85 were similar men, technical sergeants and staff sergeants mostly, radar specialists, communications technicians, men who'd volunteered for this dangerous classified mission because they believed it mattered, because they were professionals, because that's what you do when your country needs you. Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Blanton was the commander. He'd been a pilot earlier in his career. Now he commanded the crews rotating through Massacre 85. But he had no authority over the perimeter defense, couldn't order evacuations, couldn't make tactical decisions about the site's security. That authority rested with Ambassador Sullivan in Vientiane, the capital of Laos. Sullivan controlled everything about American operations in Laos. He was the final authority, not the military commanders, the ambassador, because this was a political mission as much as a military one, and political considerations outweighed tactical ones. This command structure would prove disastrous. When intelligence showed that North Vietnamese forces were massing around Pho Pha Thi, Blanton couldn't order reinforcements, couldn't order defensive improvements, couldn't even order an evacuation without Sullivan's approval. And Sullivan was hundreds of miles away in Vientiane, making decisions based on incomplete information and political calculations that had nothing to do with the tactical situation on the ground. The airmen on Massacre 85 worked 12-hour shifts, 2 crews, one on days, one on nights, operating the radar around the clock, guiding bombing missions continuously. They lived in crude facilities, plywood buildings on the mountaintop, no heat, no air conditioning, primitive conditions, but they made it work because that's what professionals do. They adapt, they overcome. They complete the mission regardless of hardships. They couldn't leave the mountain, too dangerous. The surrounding territory was controlled by the enemy. The only way on or off was by helicopter. So, they stayed on the summit, week after week, month after month, operating the radar, directing bombing missions, watching the jungle below, knowing the enemy was out there, knowing they were vulnerable, knowing that if something went wrong, rescue would be difficult and might not come in time. And they knew something was wrong, because the signs were everywhere. From November 1st, 1967 through March 10th, 1968, Lima Site 85 operated continuously. 18 weeks, the radar never stopped, day and night. Good weather and bad. American aircraft struck targets in North Vietnam and northern Laos with unprecedented accuracy. And it was all because of the radar facility on top of Pho Pha Thi. The numbers tell the story. Lima Site 85 directed 507 bombing missions during those 18 weeks. That was 27% of all strikes against targets in northern Laos and North Vietnam. Nearly a third of the bombing campaign relied on this one facility. Without it, those missions couldn't have been flown. The targets would have been untouchable during the monsoon season. The bombing campaign would have been cut in half. But the impact was even greater during the monsoon itself. When cloud cover made visual bombing impossible, Lima Site 85 became critical. In January 1968, at Wamb, the peak of the monsoon season, 23% of all bombing missions in northern North Vietnam were directed by the radar on Pho Pha Thi, almost 1 in 4 strikes. On some days, Lima Site 85 controlled 45 sorties, 45 aircraft, all guided by the handful of technicians on that mountaintop, striking targets throughout North Vietnam. The types of missions varied. F-105 Thunder Chiefs, flying from bases in Thailand, would check in with Lima Site 85's radar operators. The operators would track the aircraft, calculate the bombing solution based on wind, altitude, and target coordinates, and guide the pilot to the release point. When the calculations were perfect, the operator would give the command, "Ready, ready, now." The pilot would release his bombs, and miles away, invisible below the clouds, the bombs would hit their targets. Storage depots, barracks, bridges, railroad yards, all destroyed by bombs released through clouds so thick the pilots never saw the ground. B-52 Stratofortresses flying from Guam on arc-light missions used Lima Site 85 for navigation and final attack headings. These massive bombers carried 70,000 pounds of bombs. When they struck, they obliterated everything in a box pattern called a strike cell. Lima Site 85's radar ensured those patterns hit exactly where planners intended. That kind of precision had been impossible before. Now it was routine. The facility also directed strikes in northern Laos, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, truck parks where North Vietnamese forces staged supplies for shipments south, storage areas hidden in caves, trail junctions where supplies were distributed. All of these targets were hit with increasing frequency as Lima Site 85 made precision bombing possible regardless of weather. This had a dramatic impact on North Vietnam's war effort. Before Lima Site 85, the monsoon season was a sanctuary. When clouds covered the north, the bombing slowed. North Vietnamese workers repaired damage. Supplies were moved openly. Anti-aircraft batteries were repositioned. Everything that couldn't be done during clear weather happened during the monsoon. Then, when the monsoon ended, the bombing intensified again. It was a cycle. Bomb, repair, bomb again. Never complete destruction because there was always time to recover. Lima Site 85 broke that cycle. The bombing never stopped. Even in the worst weather, strikes continued. Rails were cut and couldn't be repaired before the next strike hit. Storage depots were destroyed and replacements were hit before they could be established. Anti-aircraft batteries couldn't be safely moved because precision bombing continued day and night. The sustained pressure was devastating to North Vietnamese logistics and morale. The North Vietnamese noticed. How could they not? Suddenly, American aircraft were hitting targets through solid overcast. Missions that should have been impossible were succeeding. Bombs were landing with precision that cloud cover should have prevented. Something had changed. The Americans had a new capability, and North Vietnamese intelligence needed to find out what it was. At first, they didn't know about Lima Site 85. They assumed the Americans had improved their radar systems in South Vietnam or Thailand, but analysis of the bombing patterns showed something strange. The accuracy was too good for radar systems at those distances. The calculations were too precise. The Americans had to have a radar site closer to North Vietnam. Much closer, but where? Reconnaissance missions began. North Vietnamese aircraft probed the border areas, looking for radar emissions. Ground teams searched for signs of American installations. Intelligence officers analyzed every bit of information they could gather, and gradually they focused on Laos. On the mountains near the border, on reports from Pathet Lao, forces about increased air activity around certain peaks. And then they found it, Pho Pa Thai. Intelligence analysis, combined with reports from ground forces, made it clear. The Americans had built a radar facility on top of that mountain, a facility that was guiding bombing missions against North Vietnam, a facility that had to be destroyed if the bombing campaign was to be blunted, a facility that had just become North Vietnam's highest priority target. Late December 1967, North Vietnamese scouts began probing the defenses around Pho Pha Thi. Small patrols, reconnaissance teams, watching the mountain, observing routines, counting defenders, looking for weaknesses. The Hmong forces guarding the mountain noticed. They reported the increased enemy activity to their CIA advisors. Something was building. On January 10, 1968, a North Vietnamese patrol was detected near the base of the mountain. Hmong soldiers engaged them and drove them off. That was routine. Enemy probes happened frequently, but the pattern was increasing. More patrols, closer to the mountain, more aggressive. This wasn't just routine reconnaissance. This was preparation for something bigger. January 12, 1968, 1 in the afternoon. 2 Russian-built Antonov An-2 biplanes appeared over Pho Pha Thi. These were World War I-looking aircraft, though they'd actually been designed in 1947 as crop dusters. But the Vietnam People's Air Force had converted them for military use. They were slow, cruising speed below 150 miles per hour. But that slowness was an advantage for the mission they were about to fly. The biplanes made 3 passes over Lima Site 85. On each pass, they dropped improvised bombs through tubes in the floor, converted 120mm mortar rounds, crude weapons, but effective. The bombs tumbled out of the aircraft, armed in the slipstream, and detonated on impact. The biplanes also fired 57mm rockets from underwing pods. It was the Vietnam People's Air Force's first and only air attack on Lima Site 85, and it was a disaster for the defenders. The bombs and rockets killed several Hmong defenders, wounded others, damaged some of the structures on the mountain, but they missed the radar equipment. The TSQ-81 systems was intact. The mission could continue. Still, the attack proved several things. First, North Vietnam knew exactly where Lima Site 85 was. Second, they were willing to attack it directly. Third, the defenses weren't strong enough to stop even a primitive air attack. And fourth, this was just the beginning. An Air America helicopter happened to be landing when the biplanes attacked. Captain Ted Moore, the pilot, had just delivered ammunition to the site. When he saw the biplanes, he took off to avoid being destroyed on the ground. Then he did something audacious. He chased one of the biplanes. His crew chief, Glenn Woods, leaned out of the helicopter with an AK-47 and fired down at the biplane. Moore later said the attack looked like World War I. A helicopter chasing a biplane while someone shot at it with a rifle. They didn't shoot down the biplane, but they drove it off. And Moore had a story he'd tell for the rest of his life. The attack galvanized American commanders. Lima Site 85 was clearly in danger. The enemy knew where it was and was willing to attack it. What would come next? Ground assault? More air attacks? Something had to be done to improve the defenses. Except nothing was done. Because improving the defenses would require admitting that American military personnel were in Laos operating a combat facility. That would violate the Geneva Accords. It would create a political firestorm. So, the decision was made to continue operations and hope for the best. The technicians on Lima Site 85 weren't happy with that decision. They'd attached demolition charges to all the sensitive equipment. If the site was about to be overrun, they'd blow up the radar and other classified gear to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. But after the biplane attack, they realized something. What if incoming artillery hit the demolition charges? The explosives might detonate and destroy the equipment before anyone could evacuate. So the technicians dismantled the charges and threw them over the cliff. Now, if the site was overrun, there was no way to quickly destroy the equipment. It would fall into enemy hands intact. This decision would have consequences. But in January 1968, with artillery shells potentially able to detonate the demolition charges, it seemed like the right call. The immediate threat was incoming fire. The threat of ground assault seemed distant. The cliffs were nearly vertical on 3 sides. The 4th side was heavily fortified. American commanders believed the mountain was impregnable. An infantry assault couldn't succeed. The defenses were adequate. Everything would be fine. Everything was not fine. January 30th, 1968. Lima. Site 85 came under mortar fire. Not a sustained barrage, just a few rounds, probing, testing the defenses, seeing how quickly American air support could respond, seeing where the defensive positions were, more reconnaissance by fire. The enemy was learning. Preparing. February 18th, 1968. A Hmong patrol intercepted a North Vietnamese artillery survey team near the head of the road that approached Pho Pha Thi from the northeast. The patrol killed a PAVN major. On his body, they found a notebook, Intelligence Gold. The notebook contained detailed plans for an attack on Lima Site 85, 3 PAVN battalions, 1 Pathet Lao battalion, heavy artillery support, a multi-battalion assault designed to overwhelm the defenses and capture the facility. This should have been the final warning. The enemy's plans were right there in black and white. They were coming, and they were coming in force. Lima Site 85 should have been evacuated immediately. The radar equipment should have been blown in place. The personnel should have been extracted by helicopter, cut the losses and move on. Better to lose the facility than lose the facility and the people manning it. But Ambassador Sullivan didn't order an evacuation. The radar was too valuable. The bombing campaign depended on it. Evacuating would mean admitting defeat. It would mean months without that capability while another site was found and equipped. It would mean giving North Vietnam a respite from all-weather bombing. Unacceptable. Lima Site. 85 would stay operational. The defenses would be reinforced. Airstrikes would disrupt the enemy buildup. Everything would be fine. Between February 20th and 29th, Lima Site 85 directed 342 airstrikes within 30 meters of the facility itself. Danger close strikes designed to disrupt the North Vietnamese preparations. F-4, Phantoms and A-1 Sky Raiders pounded suspected enemy assembly areas. B-52s carpet-bombed approach routes. Helicopter gunships strafed the jungle around the mountain. The Americans threw everything they had at the enemy forces gathering below. It wasn't enough. Let's pause for a moment and appreciate the absurdity of what happened on January 12th. 2 biplanes, aircraft that looked like they belonged in a World War I museum, attacked a modern radar facility defended by American air power. And they succeeded, not in destroying the radar, but in hitting the site and escaping. How did that happen? The answer reveals a lot about the assumptions American commanders were making. They assumed air defense wasn't necessary at Lima Site 85. The facility was secret. The enemy didn't know where it was. Even if they did, they couldn't attack it effectively. The Vietnamese People's Air Force barely existed. It had a handful of MiG fighters for air defense. It had no real ground attack capability. An air attack on Lima Site 85 wasn't considered a serious threat. Those assumptions were wrong. The enemy knew exactly where Lima Site 85 was, and while the Vietnamese People's Air Force couldn't mount a sophisticated ground attack campaign, they could cobble together something crude that might work. The An-2 biplanes weren't advanced. They were slow, vulnerable, but they didn't need to be advanced. They just needed to drop some bombs on the mountain and get away, and they did. The An-2 was designed as a crop duster, single-engine biplane, 2-man crew, cruising speed around 140 miles per hour. In combat, that slowness was usually a liability. Fast jets would shoot slow aircraft down easily. But on January 12th, the slowness was an advantage. The biplanes approached Pho Pha Thi at low altitude. They stayed below the radar coverage. By the time defenders spotted them, they were already overhead. The bombs were crude, 120mm mortar rounds with simple impact fuses, loaded into tubes in the floor of the aircraft. When the plane was over the target, the crew released the rounds. They tumbled through the air, stabilizing somewhat from the fins. When they hit, they exploded, not precision weapons by any means, but accurate enough at low altitude, and the biplanes made 3 passes. That gave them multiple chances to hit their targets. The Vietnamese People's Air Force had practiced this attack. They'd trained the crews specifically for this mission. The pilots knew the route. They knew the target. They knew they'd probably only get 1 chance before American fighters showed up. So they made it count. 3 passes, drop all their ordnance, fire their rockets. Then run for home at low altitude before American jets could intercept. It worked. The biplanes hit Lima Site 85, killed several Hmong defenders, damaged buildings, proved that the facility was vulnerable to air attack, and they escaped. American fighters were scrambled, but by the time they arrived, the biplanes were gone. Back across the border into North Vietnam, mission accomplished. The biplane attack was militarily insignificant. A few casualties, minor damage. The radar kept operating, but psychologically, it was huge. It proved the enemy knew where Lima Site 85 was. It proved they could attack it, and it proved the defenses were inadequate. If 2 slow biplanes could hit the facility, what could a determined ground assault accomplish? American commanders should have taken that lesson to heart. They didn't. They reassured themselves that ground assault was still impossible. The mountain was too steep. The cliffs were unclimbable. The defenses were adequate against infantry. Air attacks were a fluke. Everything would be fine. They were wrong. Because at that moment, 33 North Vietnamese commandos were undergoing specialized training for a mission that American commanders thought was impossible. Late 1967, while Lima Site 85 was being constructed and brought online, North Vietnamese forces were massing in northern Laos. The Pay Vien 766th Regiment moved into position near Pho Pha Thi. Pathet Lao battalions joined them, 3 PAVN battalions, 1 Pathet Lao battalion. More than 3,000 troops, all focused on one objective, Lima Site 85. They didn't hide their movements. American aerial reconnaissance spotted them. Analysts in Saigon and Vientiane watched the enemy build up with growing alarm. This wasn't routine enemy activity. This was preparation for a major offensive. The intelligence was unambiguous. The enemy was coming, and they were coming for Lima Site 85. But what could be done? The defenders on Pho Pha Thi were vastly outnumbered. About 1,000 Hmong troops guarded the mountain, 200 on the ridgeline around the summit, 800 in the valley below. They were reinforced by 300 Thai border patrol police. Tough fighters, experienced, but still heavily outnumbered. 1,500 defenders against 3,000 attackers. Not good odds. American commanders couldn't send regular U.S. military units to reinforce the position. That would violate the Geneva Accords. It would expose the secret war that everyone was pretending wasn't happening. It would create a political crisis. So the Hmong and Thai defenders would have to hold alone, with air support, but without ground reinforcements. They'd done it before. Maybe they could do it again. The North Vietnamese were building roads. Aerial reconnaissance showed heavy equipment clearing jungle and cutting roads through the mountains. They were bringing up artillery, moving it into position to bombard Pho Pha Thi. Engineers surveyed firing positions. Supply convoys brought ammunition forward. All the preparations for a major assault. And American commanders watched it happen, unable to stop it. Airstrikes tried to disrupt the preparations. F-4. Phantoms bombed suspected artillery positions. B-52s hit road junctions and supply depots. Helicopter gunships strafed troop concentrations. Between late February and early March, hundreds of sorties were flown against enemy forces around Pho Pha Thi. Thousands of bombs were dropped. Countless enemy soldiers must have been killed or wounded. But the preparations continued. The enemy was willing to take casualties. This attack mattered too much to abandon because of airstrikes. The North Vietnamese had learned from years of fighting Americans. They knew how to counter air power, disperse forces, dig in, move at night, use jungle cover, accept casualties as the price of continuing operations. They'd paid that price before. they'd pay it again. Because destroying Lima Site 85 was worth any cost. Inside the command structure, debates raged. Should Lima Site 85 be evacuated? The intelligence was clear. A major attack was imminent. The defenders were outnumbered. The mountain might not be as impregnable as everyone thought. Maybe it was time to cut losses, destroy the equipment, evacuate the personnel. Better to lose the radar than lose the radar and the people. But Ambassador Sullivan refused to order evacuation. The radar was too important, too valuable. Evacuation would mean suspending commando club missions. That would give North Vietnam relief from all-weather bombing. Unacceptable. The bombing campaign depended on Lima Site 85. It would stay operational as long as possible. The defenses would hold. Air power would make the difference. Everything would be fine. CIA assessments were less optimistic. By February 25th, CIA analysts predicted Lima Site 85 couldn't be held beyond March 10th. They were exactly right, but their assessment didn't change the decision. Sullivan believed the site could be defended. He believed American air power could offset the enemy's numerical superiority. He believed the mountain itself was the best defense, and he was unwilling to abandon Lima Site 85 until absolutely necessary. Colonel Jerry Clayton, the overall commander of the Lima Site 85 mission, wasn't on the mountain during these final weeks. He'd been relieved by Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Blanton, so Clayton could return to the United States and bring back a fresh crew. The plan was for Blanton to hold the position for 8 days. Then Clayton would return with new personnel, rotate the crews, give everyone a break. It seemed like a reasonable plan, but it meant Clayton wasn't there when the attack came. He'd spend the rest of his life haunted by that timing. Blanton was on the mountain with 16 technicians, including Chief Master Sergeant Richard Etchberger. They operated the radar continuously, day and night, directing bombing missions, trying not to think about the thousands of enemy troops gathering below them, trying to believe the mountain would protect them. That air power would save them if things went wrong. That evacuation helicopters could get them out if necessary. Trying to believe they'd survive. They had no authority to evacuate themselves. Only Sullivan could order that. And Sullivan hadn't. So they stayed on the mountain, operating the radar, completing the mission. While below them, in the jungles of northern Laos, 33 North Vietnamese commandos prepared for an assault that American commanders thought was impossible. December 18, 1967. While American analysts debated whether Lima Site 85 could be defended, soldiers of the PAVN 41st Special Forces Battalion began their mission. Not the assault, the reconnaissance. Phase 1. Watching Lima Site 85. Learning the routines, understanding the defenses, finding the weaknesses. The 41st Special Forces Battalion was elite, the best the North Vietnamese Army had. Commandos trained in special, operations, infiltration, sabotage, raids against hard targets. They'd been preparing for this mission for 9 months. 9 months of specialized training, mountain warfare, rock climbing, physical conditioning, jungle operations in the most extreme conditions. They had trained for this one objective, Lima Site 85. And now they were watching their target, learning everything they could before the assault. First Lieutenant Truong Mooch commanded the assault element, 33 men, a reinforced platoon, plus a 9-man sapper squad, plus communication specialists. These weren't regular infantry. These were the North Vietnamese equivalent of special forces or rangers. Men selected for physical fitness, intelligence, and dedication. Men who could be trusted with a mission this important. Men who would succeed or die trying. The reconnaissance phase lasted weeks. PAV and scouts watched Lima Site 85 from hidden positions in the jungle. They observed when helicopters landed, when shifts changed, where the defenders positioned themselves. Where the weaknesses were in the perimeter, they took notes, drew maps, photographed what they could, built a complete picture of the target. On January 22, 1968, 6 PAVN sappers did something American commanders thought was impossible. They climbed the north cliffs of Pho Pa Thi, the sheer rock faces that were supposed to be unscalable, in darkness, without equipment. They climbed to the summit, observed the American positions from close range, and climbed back down without being detected. Phase 2, complete. This reconnaissance was critical. The sappers confirmed that the north cliffs, while steep, could be climbed. They identified the exact route they could use during the assault. They pinpointed American and Hmong positions. They located the radar equipment. They found where the Americans slept, where they worked, where they were vulnerable, and they reported all of this back to their commanders. The assault plan could now be finalized. The commandos began final preparations on February 28th. They marched from their base toward the assembly point near Pho Pa Thi. Each man carried massive loads: an AK-47 rifle with 200 rounds, 6 hand grenades, 400 grams of explosives. Some carried RPG launchers with 6 rockets. All carried 15 days of rations, water, medical supplies, ropes, everything they'd need for the mission. The total load was between 93 and 99 pounds per man, and they had to carry it through jungle and up a mountain. They arrived at the assembly point on March 1st. The first thing they did was test fire all their weapons, ensure everything worked. You don't go into combat with untested equipment. Rounds were fired. Grenades were thrown into a safe area to verify the fuses worked. Explosives were checked. RPG launchers were test fired. Everything had to be perfect. One weapon malfunction during the assault could doom the mission. While the commandos tested their weapons, diversionary operations began. North Vietnamese forces attacked Muang Son, a town to the northwest of Pho Pa Thi. The attack was designed to make Hmong and American intelligence think the enemy's main effort was elsewhere, draw attention away from Pho Pa Thi, make the defenders think they weren't the primary target. It worked. For a few days, some commanders thought the attack on Muang Son was the enemy's main objective. They were wrong. By March 9th, the PAVN 41st Special Forces Battalion was in position at the base of Pho Pa Thi. The final preparations were complete. Weapons tested, routes confirmed, orders given. Each man knew his mission. They'd rehearsed it dozens of times during training. Now they'd do it for real. Climb the unclimbable cliffs, assault the impregnable fortress, destroy the radar facility, kill or capture the Americans. Complete the mission or die trying. The commandos rested during the day on March 10th. You don't assault a mountaintop after marching through jungle with 90-pound loads. You rest, you eat, you check your gear one final time. You think about what's coming. Maybe you think about home, about family, about whether you'll survive the night. Most won't. Special operations missions have high casualty rates. Everyone knows this, but they're still going, because that's what commandos do. They volunteer for impossible missions, and they complete them. As the sun set on March 10th, 1968, the final orders were given. Tonight. We attack tonight. The artillery barrage will begin at 6 p.m. That's our cover. When the artillery starts, the 766th Regiment and the Pathet Lao Battalion will assault the valley positions. They'll tie down the Hmong and Thai defenders, keep them from reinforcing the summit. While that happens, we climb. We climb in darkness, in silence, 90 pounds on our backs. Up cliffs the Americans think are impossible. And when we reach the summit, we attack, we kill everyone, we destroy the radar, we complete the mission. And at 6 p.m. on March 10th, the artillery began, the largest North Vietnamese offensive in Laos to that point. 3,000 troops, heavy artillery, mortars, rockets, all focused on one objective. Lima Site 85, the secret installation on top of Pho Pha Thai, the radar facility that had guided 507 bombing missions against North Vietnam, the facility that American commanders thought was safe. It wasn't safe, and for the 19 Americans on that mountain, the next few hours would be hell. March 10th, 1968. Morning. The technicians on Lima Site 85 went about their routines, operating the radar, directing bombing missions, maintenance on the equipment, the usual 12-hour shifts, trying to stay focused on the work, trying not to think about the intelligence reports, trying not to notice that the situation was deteriorating. Everyone on the mountain knew an attack was coming. You couldn't miss it. Artillery had been falling sporadically for weeks. Enemy patrols probed closer every day. The Hmong defenders were nervous. The 2 CIA officers on the mountain, the ones coordinating with the Hmong forces, were worried. They'd seen the intelligence. They knew what was gathering below, and they knew the defenses weren't adequate. But orders were orders. Stay on the mountain, keep the radar operational, continue the mission. Ambassador Sullivan hadn't authorized evacuation, so they stayed. What else could they do? These were military men, even if officially they were civilians. Military men follow orders. You don't abandon your post because you're scared. You stay until you're ordered to leave. That's the code. That's what professionals do. Technical Sergeant James Gary had arrived in late February, a combat controller. His job was directing airstrikes. If Lima Site 85 came under attack, Gary would coordinate close air support. Call in fighters, talk them onto targets. Keep the enemy from overrunning the position through concentrated air power. He'd been replaced on March 4th by Sergeant Roger Huffman, another combat controller, same mission. Be ready to direct airstrikes if things went bad. The presence of combat controllers was acknowledgement that things might go bad. You don't send specialists to coordinate close air support unless you think you'll need close air support. The Air Force knew Lima Site 85 was in danger. They were preparing for the worst, but they weren't evacuating. Not yet. The mission was too important. A few more days, a few more missions. Squeeze every possible sortie out of Lima Site 85 before abandoning it. The value of each additional bombing mission was judged worth the risk. That calculation would prove tragically wrong. On the evening of March 10th, Lieutenant Colonel Blanton and his crew were on duty. 16 technicians total, plus Blanton, plus 2 CIA officers, plus the combat controller. 19 Americans on the summit, and in the valley below, about 1,500 Hmong and Thai defenders. Against them, 3,000 North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao troops. 2-to-1 odds, not good. But the defenders had air support. That should even things out. That's what everyone told themselves. At 6 p.m., the artillery barrage began. Mortars, field guns, rockets, hundreds of rounds falling on and around Pho Pha Thi. The Hmong positions in the valley took the worst of it. American A-26 bombers and F-4 Phantoms were overhead within minutes, dropping bombs on suspected enemy artillery positions. But the enemy artillery kept firing. They dug in, camouflaged their positions, accepted that some guns would be destroyed. The rest kept firing. The barrage was cover. While shells fell and American aircraft struck back, infantry of the 766th Regiment and Pathet Lao battalions assaulted the valley positions. Hmong and Thai defenders fought back. Machine guns, mortars, small arms fire. The fighting was intense, but the defenders were doing their job, holding the valley positions, preventing enemy forces from advancing up the main trails toward the summit. Everyone's attention was on the valley, on the conventional assault happening below. Nobody was looking at the North Cliffs, the impossible cliffs, the cliffs that couldn't be climbed. And that's exactly what the North Vietnamese had planned. While everyone watched the valley, 33 commandos were climbing the north face of Pho Pha Thi in total darkness. The technicians in the radar van could hear the artillery falling outside. You can't miss it. The whistle of incoming rounds, the crump of explosions, the whole mountain shaking. But they had a job to do. Bombers were inbound. Missions were scheduled. The radar had to keep operating regardless of what was happening around it. Lieutenant Colonel Blanton was directing airstrikes through the combat controller. F-4 Phantoms were hitting enemy artillery positions. A-26 bombers were striking troop concentrations in the valley. The air support was heavy, constant. Surely it would be enough. Surely the defenders would hold. This was what American air power was for. Overwhelming firepower, precision strikes, technology defeating numbers. Through the night, aircraft struck targets around Pho Pha Thi. Pilot after pilot checked in, received targeting information, rolled in on their runs, dropped their ordnance, pulled off target. The cycle repeated continuously. Hundreds of bombs, thousands of rounds of cannon fire, napalm, cluster munitions. Everything the Air Force had was being thrown at the enemy forces below. The Hmong defenders reported that the pressure was incredible. Wave after wave of infantry attacks. They were holding, inflicting casualties. But taking casualties too. The enemy wasn't backing off. This wasn't a probing attack. This was a full-scale assault, the main event, what everyone had been dreading for months. Inside the radar facility, the technicians worked by the glow of their scopes and instruments, tracking aircraft, calculating bombing solutions, guiding pilots to their targets, professional, focused, trying not to think about what might happen if the defenses failed, trying not to imagine enemy soldiers storming the summit. There were no good escape routes if things went bad. The helicopters would come. They had to believe the helicopters would come. But would there be time? At around midnight, reports came in from the Hmong defenders. The pressure in the valley was easing slightly. Maybe the airstrikes were working. Maybe the enemy was backing off. Maybe this assault could be repulsed like previous ones. Maybe everyone would survive the night and tomorrow would bring a decision to evacuate. Maybe. People cling to hope when there's nothing else to cling to. Nobody knew that, at that moment, 33 North Vietnamese. Commandos were almost at the summit, climbing in silence. No lights, no radio chatter, nothing to give them away. Just men climbing impossible cliffs in darkness, carrying 90-pound loads, moving carefully. One handhold at a time, one foothold. Don't fall, don't make noise, just climb. And when you reach the top, kill everyone, destroy everything, complete the mission. The north cliffs of Pho Pha Thi are nearly vertical. In some places, more than vertical. Overhangs, loose rock, vegetation that tears free when you grab it. In daylight with proper climbing equipment, ascending those cliffs would be challenging. In darkness, with 90-pound loads, with no climbing gear, it should have been impossible. But the PIV and commandos had trained for this. 9 months of mountain warfare training. They'd practiced on similar cliffs. Learned which rocks would hold weight, which vegetation could be trusted, how to move silently even with heavy loads, how to help each other at difficult sections, how to keep going even when exhausted. They'd trained until it became second nature, until they could climb in their sleep. And now they were doing it for real. The 6 sappers who'd reconnaissance the mountain in January had marked the route. Small marks on rocks, barely visible even in daylight. In darkness, you had to know exactly where to look. But the commandos knew. They'd memorized the route, studied photographs. Every man knew where the holds were, where the difficult sections were, where they needed to help each other. They climbed for hours, slowly, carefully, no rushing. You rush, you make mistakes. You make mistakes, you fall, you die, and you alert the enemy, so they climb methodically, hand, foot, Test every hold, make sure it's solid, then move. 1 meter at a time, 10 meters, 50 meters, 100 meters. Don't think about how far you've climbed. Don't look down. Just focus on the next hold, the next meter, keep climbing. They climb through the artillery barrage, shells screaming overhead, exploding in the valley below and on the summit above, rock fragments falling, the entire mountain trembling from the impacts. Any one of those shells could hit the cliff, could kill them all. But they kept climbing, because that's what commandos do. You accept the mission. You execute it regardless of danger. You don't turn back because it's scary. You complete the objective, or you die trying. As they climbed higher, they could hear the battle in the valley. Small arms fire, machine guns, explosions, the distinctive sound of American jets overhead, bombs detonating, the whole symphony of war. But it was below them, behind them. They were climbing away from it, climbing toward their objective, the summit, the radar facility. The Americans who had no idea death was climbing toward them. At around 3 in the morning, the lead climbers reached a ledge near the summit. They rested, waited for the rest of the platoon to join. Them? No talking, just hand signals. Everyone okay? Everyone ready? This is it, the last section. Then we assault. We go silent until we're on top. Then we attack with everything. Grenades, RPGs, automatic fire. Surprise is our advantage. We lose surprise, we lose everything. The commandos checked their weapons, magazines seated properly, safeties off, grenades ready, RPG launchers loaded. This was it. The culmination of 9 months of training, weeks of reconnaissance, hours of climbing. Everything came down to the next few minutes. Assault the summit, kill the Americans, destroy the radar, complete the mission, for the glory of the People's Army, for the victory of the revolution, for the independence of Vietnam. At 3:45 a.m. on March 11th, 1968, the North Vietnamese commandos reached the summit of Pho Pha Thi, and the Americans had no idea they were there. The first indication something was wrong came when grenades started exploding, inside buildings, outside the radar van, near the operations center. The commandos had reached the summit undetected. They were throwing grenades into every structure, shooting anyone they saw, moving fast, overwhelming the Americans before they could organize a defense. Most of the Americans were sleeping. It was the middle of the night. They were off duty. Or they were in the radar van, focused on their scopes, not expecting an attack from inside the perimeter. The grenades and gunfire came without warning. No alarm, no defensive fire from Hmong positions. Just sudden violence in the darkness. Lieutenant Colonel Blanton was one of the first killed, shot as he emerged from his quarters. Several technicians died in their bunks, never knew what hit them. Others were wounded by grenade fragments, stumbled out of damaged buildings, trying to understand what was happening. Where were the attackers? How did they get past the defenses? What was going on? Chief Master Sergeant Richard Etchberger was in the radar van when the attack began. He heard the explosions, the gunfire. He knew immediately what it meant. Enemy on the summit. The impossible had happened. They'd gotten through. Now survival was the only thing that mattered. Etchberger grabbed an M16 rifle. He'd had little combat training. He was a radar technician, not an infantryman, but he knew how to shoot. Everyone in the Air Force learned basic rifle marksmanship. He'd have to make do with that. He left the radar van, saw North Vietnamese soldiers moving through the facility, shooting anyone they found, throwing grenades, destroying equipment. Several wounded American technicians were huddled near the radar equipment, some shot, some hit by grenade fragments, all terrified. Etchberger moved toward them, firing at the commandos when he had clear shots, keeping them at bay, buying time for the wounded to find cover. The Americans fell back from the main facility. There was nowhere to go. The summit was overrun. The only option was the cliff edge. Several Americans reached a narrow ledge about 10 feet below the summit edge. It overlooked the valley, hundreds of feet straight down. But it was cover. The commandos would have difficulty reaching them there. They'd have to expose themselves to shoot at the Americans. Etchberger helped the wounded down to the ledge, lowered them carefully, made sure they didn't fall. Then he took up a defensive position. 4 Americans survived the initial assault. Chief Master Sergeant Richard Etchberger, Technical Sergeant John Daniel, Captain Stanley Sliz, one of the CIA officers, and Staff Sergeant Jack Starling. Daniel and Sliz were wounded. Starling was uninjured. Etchberger had minor wounds but was still functional. 4 men, on a ledge, surrounded by 30-plus enemy commandos who wanted them dead. Etchberger organized the defense. He had an M16 with limited ammunition. Starling had a weapon. They'd defend the ledge, keep the enemy from getting close enough to throw grenades or shoot down at them. Meanwhile, they needed rescue. Etchberger had a radio. He began calling for air support and helicopters. "We're under attack. Enemy on the summit. We need evacuation immediately. Send everything you've got." The North Vietnamese tried to reach the ledge. They'd lean over the cliff edge and fire down at the Americans, throw grenades. But Etchberger and Starling would return fire, drive them back. The angle was difficult for both sides. The Americans couldn't see much above the ledge. The North Vietnamese couldn't get a clear shot without exposing themselves. It was a stalemate, but a stalemate that favored the enemy. Time was on their side. They controlled the summit. They could wait. Probe for weaknesses. Eventually overwhelm the Americans through numbers and patience, unless help arrived first. As dawn approached on March 11th, American aircraft overhead couldn't distinguish friend from enemy. The summit was overrun. North Vietnamese commandos controlled it, but Americans were somewhere down there, on a ledge, still alive, still fighting. The pilots couldn't bomb the summit without killing the Americans they were trying to save. All they could do was wait for helicopter rescue and provide cover when it arrived. Etchberger stayed on the radio, directing any aircraft that checked in. "Enemy positions here. Don't hit this area. Friendlies present. Keep suppressing the valley. Don't let reinforcements reach the summit." His calm voice over the radio impressed everyone who heard it. No panic, no hysteria. Just professional communication from a man in the worst situation imaginable. Directing airstrikes while defending a ledge, while keeping wounded men alive, while doing everything possible to survive until rescue arrived. The wounded needed care. Daniel was badly hurt. Sliz had serious injuries. They were bleeding, in shock. Without medical treatment, they might die before rescue came. Etchberger did what he could. Applied. Pressure to wounds. kept them conscious, talked to them, told them helicopters were coming. Hold on, just hold on, help is coming, just a little longer. The North Vietnamese on the summit were busy. They weren't just trying to kill the Americans on the ledge. They were destroying equipment, the radar system, the TACAN, the operations center, everything of value. They'd brought explosives for this purpose. Now they set charges, wired them together, prepared to demolish everything. Some commandos were collecting documents, intelligence, anything that might have value. Others were setting up defensive positions. American helicopters would come. When they did, the commandos needed to be ready to shoot them down. This is where First Lieutenant Truong Mook, the commando leader, made a decision that would haunt him. His orders were to capture the radar facility intact if possible, take prisoners if possible, bring back intelligence and equipment for analysis. But the situation had evolved. The Americans had fought back. The facility was partially destroyed in the fighting. And now his men were setting demolition charges to finish the job. Mook let them. Maybe he thought the facility was too damaged to salvage. Maybe he thought extracting intact equipment from the Mountaintop was impossible with American air power overhead. Maybe in the chaos of combat, following orders perfectly wasn't possible. Whatever his reasoning, the commandos destroyed the radar equipment. They set charges, blew up the van, demolished what they couldn't carry, and they killed prisoners. Most of the Americans who died on Lima Site 85 were killed in the initial assault or executed afterward. Mook's superiors would court-martial him for this. They wanted prisoners. They wanted intact equipment. Mook would return home to punishment instead of praise. But that was in the future. On March 11th, all that mattered was the battle, and Etchberger was still fighting, still defending that ledge, still keeping wounded men alive, still directing air support, still believing rescue would come. At first light, Air America helicopters approached Pho Pa Thi. The pilots could see the devastation on the summit, destroyed buildings, bodies, North Vietnamese soldiers moving around, and somewhere below the summit edge, 4 Americans on a ledge. The helicopters had to get them out. But approaching under fire was suicide. They needed cover. A-1 Sky Raiders dove on the summit, strafing, firing rockets, suppressing the enemy defenders. Keep their heads down, give the helicopters a chance. The helicopters came in low and fast, hovering over the valley, unable to land. They'd have to use rescue hoists, lower slings, pull the survivors up one at a time, all while taking fire from the summit. The first helicopter hovered near the ledge, lowered a sling. Etchberger helped Daniel into it, clipped him in, signaled the crew chief. The sling lifted. Daniel was pulled up into the helicopter, slowly, painfully, taking forever. But he made it. 1 man rescued. The sling came down again. Sliz next. He was badly wounded, could barely move. Etchberger helped him into the sling, secured him, signaled again. Up went Sliz. The helicopter crew pulled him aboard. 2 men rescued. Starling went next, uninjured but exhausted. He climbed into the sling, was lifted to safety. 3 men rescued, 1 to go. Etchberger prepared to climb into the sling himself. His job was done. He'd defended the ledge, kept the wounded alive, directed air support, gotten his men into the helicopter. Now, his turn. He'd survived. Against incredible odds, he'd survived. Just had to get into that sling, get lifted to the helicopter, then he'd be safe. He climbed into the sling, secured himself, gave the signal. The winch pulled him upward, rising toward the helicopter. 10 feet, 20 feet, almost there, just a few more seconds. Then he'd be aboard. Then he'd be safe. Then he could tell his wife and sons he'd survived. Gunfire from the summit. AK-47s. The North Vietnamese had spotted him, had clear shots as he rose into the air. Rounds hit the helicopter, hit the sling, hit Etchberger. He slumped. The crew chief pulled faster, got him aboard, laid him on the floor of the helicopter, tried to stop the bleeding. But it was too late. The rounds had torn through Etchberger's body. Fatal wounds. He was still conscious, still aware, but dying. The helicopter flew to a base in Thailand. Medical personnel were waiting. They tried to save him. But the wounds were too severe. Chief Master Sergeant Richard Etchberger died without ever regaining consciousness. Never got to tell his family he loved them. Never got to see his sons grow up. Never got to receive the Medal of Honor his actions deserved. He died on that helicopter, the last casualty of Lima Site 85, the hero who'd saved 3 men and paid for it with his life. While Etchberger was being killed saving the men on the ledge, other Americans were scattered across Pho Pha Thi. Some had escaped the initial assault, had hidden in the jungle on the mountainside, were trying to evade the North Vietnamese commandos now searching for survivors. Several made it to the Hmong positions in the valley, were protected by Hmong fighters who held off the enemy. These men would be rescued later in the day. 8 Americans in total were rescued from Lima Site 85, 4 from the ledge, including the 3 Etchberger put on the helicopter before he died. 4 others from various locations on and around the mountain. They'd survived through luck, skill, and the courage of the Hmong and Thai defenders who covered their escape. 11 Americans died. Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Blanton, Technical Sergeant Melvin Holland, Staff Sergeant Henry Gish, Staff Sergeant Willis Hall, Staff Sergeant Herbert Kirk, Technical Sergeant Donald Springsteda, Sergeant David Price, and 4 others whose remains weren't immediately recovered. Most killed in the initial assault, some executed, their bodies left on the mountain when the commandos withdrew, and the North Vietnamese did withdraw. By midday on March 11th, they controlled the summit. They'd destroyed the radar facility, killed or captured the Americans, completed their mission. But they couldn't stay. American air power was relentless. Fighter bombers struck the summit continuously, made holding the position impossible. So, the commandos collected their dead and wounded, took what intelligence they could carry, and climbed back down the mountain they'd ascended the night before. According to North Vietnamese accounts, they lost 1 commando killed and 2 wounded. That seems impossibly low for an assault of this magnitude. More likely, they lost more, but didn't admit it. Or they counted only the commando platoon casualties, not the losses among supporting units. Either way, they had achieved a lopsided victory. 11 Americans killed, 8 wounded or captured according to their initial claims. The radar facility destroyed. Commando club missions terminated. All for minimal losses. It was one of the most successful special operations missions of the entire war. For the Americans, it was disaster. The largest single ground combat loss the Air Force suffered in Vietnam. 11 men dead. The others traumatized, families devastated, and all of it classified, top secret. The families couldn't be told what really happened. The American public couldn't know. The press couldn't report it. Lima Site 85 officially didn't exist. The men who died there officially died somewhere else, under different circumstances. Etchberger's family was told he'd died in a helicopter accident in Thailand. That's what his widow was told. That's what his 3 sons were told. Their father had been a civilian contractor for Lockheed, working on some project in Southeast Asia. There'd been an accident. He was dead. That's all they could be told. Security reasons. Need to know. All the usual military excuses for keeping secrets from families who deserve the truth. The Air Force recommended Etchberger for the Medal of Honor. His actions on that ledge justified it, single-handedly defending the position, directing airstrikes while under fire, keeping wounded men alive, helping them into rescue slings, sacrificing himself to save others. That's Medal of Honor level heroism. Everyone who reviewed the recommendation agreed, but the nomination was rejected, not by President Johnson as many accounts claim, by Air Force Vice Chief of Staff General John Ryan. Ryan was the approving authority for Air Force medals, and he said no. The reason? Lima Site 85 was still classified. The U.S. wasn't supposed to have military personnel in Laos. Awarding Etchberger the Medal of Honor would expose the secret, would violate the fiction that only civilian contractors worked there, would create political problems. So, Etchberger received the Air Force Cross instead, the second highest Air Force decoration, awarded in a secret ceremony at the Pentagon. His widow attended. She was told her husband had done something heroic. She couldn't be told what. Security. Need to know. She accepted the medal, went home, raised 3 sons alone, never knowing the full story of how her husband died, never knowing he deserved the nation's highest honor, but was denied it because politics mattered more than truth. The secret war in Laos was publicly disclosed in 1970. 2 years after Lima Site 85 fell, Congress held hearings. The press finally reported on operations that had been going on for years. The American public learned that thousands of Americans had been fighting in Laos, that the CIA had recruited a secret army, that billions of dollars had been spent on a war that officially didn't exist. But the disclosure revealed nothing about Lima Site 85. That remained classified. The families still didn't know. The Air Force visited them in 1970 and gave them more details. But not the full story, not the truth. Just enough to partially satisfy their questions without revealing the full extent of what had happened. Anne Holland, widow of Technical Sergeant Melvin Holland, wasn't satisfied. She knew she wasn't getting straight answers. So, in 1975, she sued the Air Force and Lockheed for negligence. She argued the government hadn't candidly informed her about her husband's death, that she deserved the truth, that the families deserved answers. The lawsuit brought attention. The Air Force didn't want the details of Lima Site 85 becoming public through a civil trial, so they settled, paid Holland and the other families. But the classification remained. The full story still couldn't be told. Need to know? Security, national interest, all the usual justifications for keeping secrets. A top-secret Air Force history of Lima. Site 85 was written in August 1968, 5 months after the battle. That document was classified for 20 years. It was finally declassified in 1988. By then, the families had been living with incomplete information for 2 decades. 2 decades of not knowing, of suspecting they weren't being told everything, of wondering what really happened on that mountain. In 1996, Vietnam published its own account of the battle, a document titled Raid on the Takan Site atop Pha Thi Mountain by a military region sapper team on 11 March 1968. It was written by someone involved in the operation, maybe a commando who'd been there, maybe a commander who'd planned it. The document gave details the Americans had never released. The 9 months of training, the reconnaissance missions, the climb up the North Cliffs, the assault, the destruction of the facility. The Department of Defense obtained and translated this Vietnamese account in 1998. Finally, 30 years after the battle, a detailed description of what happened existed in English. Researchers could piece together the full story. The families could learn the truth. Well, part of it. Some details remained classified. Some questions remained unanswered, but at least the outlines were clear. In 1999, researcher Timothy Castle published One Day Too Long, a comprehensive book about Lima Site 85. Castle had interviewed survivors, reviewed classified documents that had been declassified, talked to CIA officers and Hmong veterans, put together the most complete account yet published. The book filled in gaps, corrected errors in earlier accounts, gave the families more answers. But Richard Etchberger's family still didn't know their father was a hero. They knew he'd died in some kind of accident. They knew he'd received the Air Force Cross. But they didn't know why. Didn't know he'd saved 3 men. Didn't know he deserved the Medal of Honor. 42 years they didn't know. 42 years of carrying a secret their father had been ordered to keep. A secret that died with him on that helicopter. 1968 to 2010. 42 years. That's how long it took for Richard Etchberger to receive the recognition he deserved. 42 years of his widow, Catherine, not knowing the full truth. 42 years of his sons, Richard, Stephen, and Corey, not knowing their father was a hero. 42 years of the Air Force knowing it had denied a Medal of Honor to a man who deserved it, and doing nothing to correct that injustice. Why did it take so long? Part of it was classification. The Lima Site 85 mission remained highly classified for decades. You can't award a public medal for a classified action. The ceremony would expose details that were supposed to remain secret. The citation would describe events that officially didn't happen, so Etchberger's actions stayed hidden. But Lima Site 85 was gradually declassified through the 1980s and 90s. Documents were released. Researchers published accounts. The story became public, at least in outline. Veterans of the operation started talking. The Hmong who defended the mountain told their stories. By 2000, enough was public that a Medal of Honor wouldn't compromise ongoing security operations. So, why didn't it happen? Bureaucratic inertia. The Air Force had denied the original nomination. Reversing that decision would require admitting a mistake. Institutions don't like admitting mistakes. It's easier to let things stay as they are, even when staying as they are means denying a hero his due recognition. In the early 2000s, veterans of the 1st Combat Evaluation Group began pushing for Etchberger's Air Force Cross to be upgraded to the Medal of Honor. These were men who'd served alongside him, who knew what he'd done, who believed he deserved the nation's highest honor. They lobbied Congress. They contacted the Air Force. They wrote letters. They wouldn't let it go. Congress listened. In 2008, legislation was introduced to waive the time limit for awarding Etchberger the Medal of Honor. Normally, Medal of Honor nominations must be submitted within 3 years of the action. It had been 40 years, but Congress could waive that requirement, and they did. The legislation passed. The Air Force reviewed the case again, and this time, the answer was yes. On September 21, 2010, 42 years after his death, Chief Master Sergeant Richard Etchberger was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The ceremony was at the White House. President Barack Obama presented the medal to Etchberger's 3 sons. All 3 were present: Richard, Stephen, Corey, middle-aged men now, grown, with families of their own, receiving the medal their father should have gotten in 1968. Corey Etchberger, the youngest son, was 9 years old when his father died. He had few clear memories of him, just fuzzy impressions, a few images. The memories you retain from early childhood. But he'd lived his whole life not knowing how his father really died, not knowing what he'd done, not knowing he was a hero. And now, at age 51, he was learning the truth and receiving the Medal of Honor on his father's behalf. The citation was read: for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Chief Etchberger and his team of technicians were manning a top-secret defensive position at Lima Site 85 when the base was overrun by an enemy ground force. Despite having received little or no combat training, Chief Etchberger single-handedly held off the enemy with an M-16 while simultaneously directing airstrikes into the area and calling for air rescue. The citation continued. Because of his fierce defense and heroic and selfless actions, he was able to deny the enemy access to his position and save the lives of his remaining crew. With the arrival of the rescue aircraft, Chief Etchberger repeatedly and deliberately risked his own life, exposing himself to heavy enemy fire in order to place 3 surviving wounded comrades into rescue slings hanging from the hovering helicopter. With his remaining crew safely aboard, Chief Etchberger finally climbed into an evacuation sling himself, only to be fatally wounded by enemy ground fire as he was being raised into the aircraft. The Etchberger family had waited 4 decades to hear those words, to understand what happened, to know that their husband and father had died saving others, that he'd been a hero, that his sacrifice mattered. 42 years is a long time to wait for the truth. Too long, but at least it finally came. The next day, September 22nd, Etchberger was inducted into the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes. Another ceremony, more recognition. Air Force Chief of Staff General Norton Schwartz spoke. "Valor has no expiration date," he said. "Courage is timeless, and the discovery of truth, no matter how long it is delayed, sets the record straight." It was a nice sentiment, but it didn't change the fact that Etchberger's widow had died in 2003 without knowing her husband was a Medal of Honor recipient. Catherine Etchberger went to her grave believing her husband had been awarded the Air Force Cross, which was honorable, but not what he deserved. She'd lived 35 years as a widow, raised 3 sons alone, never knowing the full truth, never receiving the recognition due to the families of Medal of Honor recipients, because the Air Force valued secrecy over truth, valued politics over people, valued the fiction of Laotian neutrality over the reality of what had happened on that mountain. The remains of 11 Americans were left on Pho Pha Thi when the North Vietnamese withdrew on March 11, 1968. Some bodies were scattered around the summit. Others had been thrown over cliffs during the fighting. The Air Force couldn't recover them immediately. The area was too dangerous. Enemy forces controlled the region. A recovery mission would be suicidal, so the bodies stayed there, on the mountain, in the jungle, while the war continued, while the families mourned, while official reports listed them as killed in action, body not recovered. That designation meant the men were presumed dead, but their remains hadn't been recovered. They'd remain on the books as missing in action until their remains were found and identified. For some, that would take decades. After the war ended in 1975, recovery became theoretically possible, but Laos was controlled by the Communist Pathet Lao. Relations with the United States were hostile. The Laotian government wasn't interested in helping America recover remains. The location of Lima Site 85 was remote, difficult to access, and the remains, if any still existed after years exposed to the elements, would be scattered across a mountainside. Finding them would be incredibly difficult. But the families wanted their loved ones home. The Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, DPAA, had a mission to recover and identify remains of Americans missing from past conflicts. Lima Site 85 was on their list, high priority. But progress was slow. Diplomatic negotiations with Laos took years. Permission to conduct searches had to be obtained. Local guides had to be found. The mountain had to be accessed, which wasn't easy. Finally, in 2003, 35 years after the battle, a DPAA team reached Pho Pha Thi. They searched the summit, the ledge where Etchberger made his stand, the surrounding jungle, and they found remains. Bone fragments, personal effects, dog tags in some cases. The items were carefully collected, documented, brought back to DPAA's laboratory in Hawaii for analysis. In 2005, Technical Sergeant Patrick Shannon was identified. DNA analysis matched his remains to living family members. He came home 37 years after he died. His family held a funeral, buried him with military honors. After nearly 4 decades, they had closure, not peace. You never have peace when someone you love dies young in a war. But closure. The knowledge that he'd been recovered, that he was home, that he could rest in American soil. In 2012, 3 more airmen were identified. Technical Sergeant Donald Springsteda, Staff Sergeant Henry Gish, Technical Sergeant Willis Hall. All had been on Lima Site 85 when it fell. All had died in the assault. And now, 44 years later, they were identified and returned to their families. More funerals, more burials. More families finally getting the closure they had waited decades to receive. But 7 Americans remained unaccounted for. Their remains hadn't been found, or had been found, but couldn't be identified with available technology. The DPAA continued searching. In 2023, a team returned to Pho Pha Thi. The technology had improved. DNA analysis was more sophisticated. Forensic techniques were better. Maybe they could find more remains. Maybe they could identify more of the missing. The team rappelled down the cliffs below the summit, searched ledges where bodies might have fallen or been thrown, and they found remains. Human bones on a ledge, barely visible, easy to miss, but there. Katie Rubin, a civilian forensic anthropologist with the team, spotted them. She was attached to a rope, dangling on a cliff face in a remote Laotian jungle. And she found the remains of an American who died there 55 years earlier. The remains were carefully recovered, brought back to Hawaii, analyzed, and in 2024, 56 years after the battle, Sergeant David Price was identified. DNA matched. He was accounted for. His family, who'd waited more than half a century, finally had answers. Price had 2 daughters. One was 7 years old when he died. She'd grown up not knowing what happened to her father, not knowing where he was. Now, at age 63, she knew, and she could bury him. Give him a funeral, honor his sacrifice, bring him home. 5 Americans from Lima Site 85 remain unaccounted for as of 2025. Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Blanton, Technical Sergeant Melvin Holland, Staff Sergeant Herbert Kirk, and 2 others whose identities remain uncertain. The DPAA continues searching, using improving technology, following new leads, interviewing aging witnesses who were there. Someday, perhaps, all of them will be found. All of them will come home. All the families will have closure. But that day hasn't come yet. And for those families, the wait continues. 60 years and counting. Waiting for their loved ones to come home. Waiting for confirmation of what they've always known. That their husbands, fathers, brothers died heroes. On a mountain in Laos, in a battle that most Americans have never heard of. A battle that was classified for decades. A battle that changed the air war over North Vietnam. A battle where 11 Air Force personnel died and nobody could be told. Lima Site 85 has been forgotten. Ask 100 Americans about Vietnam War battles, and maybe one has heard of it. It's not taught in schools. It's not in most history books. It's not memorialized like other battles. There's no monument, no annual ceremony, just a few aging veterans who remember, a few families who'll never forget, and the mountain in Laos where it happened, now overgrown with jungle, showing no sign that Americans once fought and died there. Why has it been forgotten? Several reasons. First, it was classified for decades. You can't remember what you were never told. For 30 years, Lima Site 85 was a secret. The families couldn't talk about it because they didn't know the details. The Air Force couldn't acknowledge it because the mission was classified. The press couldn't report it because official sources denied it happened. So it vanished from public consciousness. Second, it was an Air Force battle, not Army or Marines. Most Americans think of Vietnam ground combat as Army and Marine infantry fighting. They don't think of Air Force technicians fighting on mountaintops in Laos. That doesn't fit the narrative. So even when the story became public, it didn't capture popular imagination the way infantry battles did. Third, it happened in Laos, not Vietnam. The secret war in Laos never got the attention the war in Vietnam did. Most Americans couldn't find Laos on a map. They certainly didn't know about American operations there. So, a battle in Laos, even a significant one, didn't resonate the way battles in Vietnam did. Fourth, it involved relatively few Americans, 11 killed, 8 rescued. That's tiny compared to other battles. Ia Drang had hundreds of casualties. Khe Sanh had hundreds. Hamburger Hill had hundreds. Lima Site 85 had 19 Americans total. The numbers don't grab attention the way mass casualty events do. And fifth, both sides had reasons not to talk about it. The United States didn't want to acknowledge it violated the Geneva Accords. North Vietnam didn't want to highlight that they'd also violated those accords. Both preferred to keep the secret war secret. So, Lima Site 85 faded from history, a battle both sides agreed to forget. But we shouldn't forget, because Lima Site 85 matters. It matters that 11 Americans died there, that Richard Etchberger sacrificed himself to save his men, that families waited decades for answers, that men fought and died in a war that officially didn't exist. Their sacrifice deserves to be remembered. Their stories deserve to be told. The lessons of Lima, Site 85 deserve to be learned. What are those lessons? First, secret wars are dangerous. When operations are classified, normal. Oversight breaks down. Decisions get made for political reasons instead of tactical ones. Men die because politicians won't acknowledge they're there. Lima Site 85 should have been evacuated when intelligence showed the attack was coming, but Ambassador Sullivan wouldn't order it because evacuating would mean admitting the facility existed. So, 19 men stayed on that mountain, and 11 died. Second, arrogance is deadly. American commanders thought Phu Pha Thi was impregnable. They thought the cliffs couldn't be climbed. They were wrong. The North Vietnamese proved it. Commandos climbed those impossible cliffs and overran a facility that was supposed to be safe. Assumptions that aren't tested get people killed. Always assume the enemy is more capable than you think. Always prepare for the worst case, because the worst case happens more often than anyone wants to admit. Third, technology isn't enough. Lima Site 85 had the most advanced radar system available. It guided bombing missions with unprecedented precision, but it couldn't defend itself. When commandos reached the summit, the radar was useless. The technicians were unarmed or barely armed. They had no combat training. Technology is meaningless if you can't protect it, if you can't defend the people operating it. The Air Force learned that lesson on March 11, 1968. Fourth, heroism matters. Richard Etchberger could have saved himself. When the attack came, he could have run, could have hidden, could have focused on his own survival. He didn't. He organized a defense, helped wounded men, directed airstrikes, put 3 men on rescue slings before climbing aboard himself. He died saving others. That's heroism. That matters. That deserves to be remembered and honored. And fifth, truth matters. The families of Lima Site 85 deserve the truth from day one. They deserve to know how their loved ones died. They deserve to know those deaths meant something. They deserve to know Richard Etchberger was a hero. Instead, they got lies, cover stories, classified information they couldn't access, It took 40 years for the full truth to emerge. That's wrong. National security matters. But so does honoring the dead and respecting their families. Secrecy should never mean lying to families about how their loved ones died. 57 years have passed since the fall of Lima Site 85. Most of the survivors are dead. The Hmong defenders who fought in the valley that night. The pilots who flew air support. The helicopter crews who conducted the rescue. They're gone. The widows who waited for answers. Most are gone too. The children who lost fathers. They're grandparents now. Or gone themselves. Time erases everything eventually. The mountain still stands. Phu Pha Thi in northern Laos. 5,800 feet of rock and jungle. Remote. Difficult to access. The summit where the radar facility stood is overgrown. Nature has reclaimed it. The buildings are gone. The radar equipment is gone. Everything destroyed in the battle or by subsequent airstrikes. If you visited today, you'd see nothing but jungle. No sign that Americans once worked there. No sign of the battle. Just wilderness. But the mountain remembers. The cliffs the commandos climbed. The ledge where Etchberger made his stand. The valleys where Hmong defenders fought and died. The mountain remembers. And the families remember. And a few aging veterans remember. And that's all that's left. Memory. Memory and the obligation to keep that memory alive. Chief Master Sergeant Richard Etchberger's name is on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Panel 45E, line 33. One name among 58,000. Most people walk past without stopping, without reading the names, without wondering who those people were, what they did, how they died. He's just a name on a wall to most visitors. But he was more than that. He was a husband, a father, a son, a brother, an airman, a hero, and his story deserves to be told. The other 10 Americans who died at Lima Site 85 deserve to be remembered too. Lieutenant Colonel Clarence Blanton, Technical Sergeant Melvin Holland, Technical Sergeant Patrick Shannon, Staff Sergeant Henry Gish, Technical Sergeant Willis Hall, Staff Sergeant Herbert Kirk, Technical Sergeant Donald Springsteda, Sergeant David Price, and the others whose names are on that wall. They volunteered for a dangerous mission. They served in a secret war. They died doing their duty. They deserve better than to be forgotten. The Battle of Lima Site 85 was the largest single ground combat loss the United States Air Force suffered in the Vietnam War. 11 men killed in less than 30 minutes. The radar facility that had guided 27% of bombing missions against North Vietnam destroyed. A secret mission exposed. A classified operation compromised. Intelligence captured by the enemy. And all of it kept secret for 3 decades while families wondered what really happened. The secrecy was necessary. That's what we were told. National security required it. The Geneva Accords prohibited American military personnel in Laos. Acknowledging Lima Site 85 would violate international agreements, would cause diplomatic problems, would expose the secret war. So, the truth had to wait. Families had to wait. Recognition had to wait. Everything waited for classified documents to be declassified, for political considerations to change, for enough time to pass that admitting the truth wouldn't cause problems. But was the secrecy worth it? Was it worth denying Richard Etchberger the Medal of Honor for 42 years? Was it worth telling his widow he died in a helicopter accident instead of saving 3 men? Was it worth keeping families in the dark about how their loved ones died? Was maintaining the fiction of Laotian neutrality worth the pain inflicted on the families of the men who died? There? I don't think so. I think the truth mattered more than the fiction. I think honoring the dead mattered more than maintaining secrecy. I think respecting families mattered more than diplomatic convenience. The men who died at Lima Site 85 deserve better. Their families deserve better. America deserved better. So, remember Lima Site 85. Remember the 19 Americans who manned that radar facility. Remember the 11 who died defending it. Remember Richard Etchberger, who saved 3 men and died in the attempt. Remember that they fought in a war that officially didn't exist. Remember that they sacrificed everything for a mission that remained classified for decades. Remember that heroism doesn't require recognition, but it deserves it. Always. Remember the secret mountain. the impossible climb, the battle at dawn, the rescue under fire, the 42 years of silence, the families who waited, the truth that eventually emerged. Remember it all, because forgetting dishonors the dead. Forgetting ensures we'll repeat the same mistakes. Forgetting means their sacrifice meant nothing. Don't let Lima Site 85 be forgotten again. Tell the story. Share it. Make sure people know what happened on that mountain in March 1968. Make sure Richard Etchberger's name is remembered not just as a line on a memorial wall, but as a hero who saved lives. Make sure all 19 Americans who were there that night are remembered as professionals who served in the worst conditions imaginable, who fought when fighting seemed hopeless, who survived or died with honor. That's what we owe them. That's the price of the secrets we keep. Truth delayed is justice denied. And the men of Lima Site 85 waited too long for justice. Waited too long for recognition. Waited too long to be remembered. We can't change that. But we can make sure they're never forgotten again. Remember Lima Site 85. Remember the secret war. Remember the men who fought and died in a country where America wasn't supposed to be fighting. Remember their sacrifice. Honor their memory. Tell their story. That's the least we can do, and the most important thing we can do. Remember.